All right, 8 o'clock, here we go. Still got a little ways to go. We got to get this done or Rick's going to fire me. All right, the time reference. Did y'all decide you want to skip it or? Oh, okay, well, come on up here, Beth, and take care of it. All right, well, let's see what we can figure out. What does the 70 weeks mean? Well, Daniel had been focused on, of course, the 70 years of captivity. That is not what this is talking about. We are sure of that. So Gabriel's message, again, he's talking about future events. He's not talking about what was going on right then. These things are going to be off in the future. Okay? So you can tell that much from this. And Gabriel is emphasizing that the events that I'm talking about in these 70 weeks, they are much more important than the 70 years of captivity that you're enduring right now. That's important, but what I'm telling you, this is a bigger deal. Okay? So let's see if we can kind of figure out something. So 70 weeks is, a week has 7 days, of course, so you have 70 weeks, that'd be 70 times 7, right? 70 weeks times 7 days, right? And so that equals 490, right? And we're going to try to figure out what that means. So it is broken down into these sections. So there's a period of 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, and then there's 1 week at the end, is how it's put in there, subdivided into those 3 sections in verse 25 and verse 27. So again, you got 70 weeks times 7 days, and that equals 490 days. Remember, this is apocalyptic language. It is figurative. It is symbolic. So it's not necessarily literal. So what a lot of scholars believe, and this is certainly a strong possibility, is that 490 days here is actually referring to 490 years. Okay? And in Ezekiel 4 and verse 6, obviously we don't have time to go read that, but it talks about the idea of each day for a year. Now, does that prove that this is what this means in Daniel? Not at all. But what it does show us that there are times that God uses that type of calculation, a day for a year. Not always, but it is used. So that means this is certainly a possibility. Okay? Not telling you for sure about anything, but seems likely that that's what he's talking about here. Okay? Again, it doesn't prove it, but God does use that kind of language sometimes. Now, some other people believe it might not necessarily be 490 years. It might just be talking about a long, indefinite period of time. That's also a possibility. Okay? You can't really rule that out either. But one thing we can try to sort of figure out, and again, this is hard to pin down too, when does it start? If it is 490 years, when does the clock start? When do they start counting it? Okay, well, that's a great question. Sort of unsure of the answer, right? But what we do know from this passage in Daniel, it's whenever the commandment went forward to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay? But there are a whole lot of different scenarios as to when that was. Okay? So for one thing, well, who gave the command? Which command are we talking about? So did God give it? Or was it one of the kings? And if so, which king? A lot of scenarios there. So a lot of scholars, they kind of argue or disagree about, where should we start this thing? And there are a lot of guys a whole lot smarter than me. But let's look at some possibilities. So remember we talked about some of the Jews are going to return. When Cyrus issues a decree and they can go back, some of them are going to return with Zerubbabel about 536 BC. Okay? And they're going to go back and they're going to rebuild the temple. Now, then there's a later group that goes, they return with Ezra about 458, 457 BC. And then we already mentioned a few minutes ago, then Nehemiah, of course, is going to come back to rebuild the wall. So one possibility, which it is kind of interesting because it would fit. Sorry, Angie. I have been known to block the sun, so you know. It's a possibility, not definitive, but it is interesting how this works out if you calculate it this way. So if you go from Ezra, if you went from that one, if you took it from the 457 BC, and then you go forward 490 years, that brings you to about 33 AD. Now, something happened in 33 AD. Yeah, Christ died on the cross, right? Now, there are people who feel like a calculation error has been made in our calendar, that it might be 3 or 4 years off. And so it's possible that Christ was crucified around 29 or 30 AD, but usually the accepted date is 33 AD. So if you went from Ezra, that's where you would come out at after 490 years. So a lot of people believe, well, maybe that's the correct calculation. That may be what it's talking about because that would seem to fit. Okay? But again, it's difficult to pinpoint what we're talking about. Now, kind of a side note, this last, where it talks about, there's 1 week at the end, 7 days at the end, or that would be 7 years, right? If you study premillennialism, and obviously we're very short on time anyway, we don't have time to jump down that rabbit hole, but you probably know the premillennialists claim there is going to be a period of tribulation. Okay? How long is that period? No, not the tribulation. That's going to be Christ, according to them, his earthly reign will be 1,000 years. But before that, a period of tribulation, how long? 7 years. 7 years. That's what they claim. Okay? That's where they get this from. Okay? Again, we don't have time to dive down that rabbit hole, but in your own studies, you go, because I used to wonder, I thought, where do they get that 7-year period of tribulation? Because I don't see, that's where they get it from. They say that last week, that's what it's talking about. That's going to be 7 years of tribulation. Okay? Now, again, I don't have time to prove it, so you need to study on your own, but I think you'll find the scriptures do not support that interpretation. It just does. There's no support for that. But I want you to know that's where they get it from. Okay? But hopefully maybe that's a starting off point for a study of your own, and it's a fascinating study. Okay? Now, so what's the last week referring to? Well, it does appear that it would be referring to Christ's personal ministry. Okay, the last week. But again, it's not, they're saying, well, this is at the end of time. No, it would seem that it's not the end of time. It's when Christ was on earth. Okay? So Christ's personal ministry, you're talking about, okay, if this is 7 years, his personal ministry lasted for about 3.5 years. Have we seen a reference to that in Daniel? We've seen that 3.5 before, several times, 42 months. Right? We've seen several references to that, so this could be another one. And so notice in verse 27, it says, and in the midst of the week, that last week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. He being the Messiah, right? And so he's saying the old law is going to end in the midst of that last week, that 7-year period, 3.5 years. If that's what it is, then that would fit. Well, what about the other 3.5 years? Well, that's when the apostles would go out. That's when the covenant is strengthened, the church is established, those kind of things, okay? So that seems to be a reasonable possibility about what this is, but no guarantees, okay? Because there's a lot of things here that we just don't understand. But what does that have to do with our salvation? Not a thing. So that's the good news, right? We don't have to. But these seem to be some reasonable conclusions that we could draw from maybe that's what the 70 weeks means. All right, so let's go to chapter 10. Okay, so question number 1, you already know that one. How long was he in captivity? 70 years plus, you could put plus, right, because it's probably a little bit more than that, but at least he was there for the whole 70 years. So here in chapter 10, we're in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus. Okay, so that shows Daniel was there for the entire 70 years and then plus a little bit. Okay, and it tells us here, question number 2, how long did Daniel mourn? It says he mourned for 3 weeks. Okay, we're not told why that is specifically, but we are told that, again, he fasted. He says he didn't clean himself up. It tells us that Daniel had received a message and he understood it. And so on the 24th day of the first month, it says he was beside the Hiddekel River, which we've already established that's the Tigris River. It's what it's called today. Now, what country is that in? You might know. What modern day country is that in? The Tigris River. What? Iraq, yeah. Okay, now, where did the Tigris River back in the day come out of? Eden, the Garden of Eden, right? There were 4 rivers, and this was one of them. Okay, so Hiddekel was a name for the Tigris River. So that's where, so Daniel is standing by this river. Okay, and so while he's there, verses 5 through 9, he sees another vision. And he tells us that there were some other men there with him, but they didn't see it. Okay, he's the only one that saw it. But he does tell us they got terrified and they ran and hid. Now, what made them do that? I don't know. They didn't see the vision, but they saw something that scared them half out of their wits, and they took off and they went into hiding. But they didn't see whatever Daniel saw. Okay? And so Daniel describes then a celestial being that appears before him. And in Revelation chapter 1, verses 10 through 17, you see there, John describes a vision of Christ. This sounds similar. There are a lot of things that kind of has in common. But in this case, it doesn't appear that he's talking about Christ. It appears to be an unnamed angel. But some of the descriptions are similar. Okay? But it's not Gabriel because he's not named. And so it tells us that Daniel was so shocked by this that he said his strength left him. Almost like fainting or, And so he said, I heard him talking, I heard a voice, but it sounded like a multitude of voices just coming from the same angel. And he's laying on the ground with his face on the ground. Because he's just, all of his strength has left him. He's so shocked by what he's seeing. So the angel, Daniel's basically flat on the ground. The angel helps him get up to, I guess, what we would describe as being on all fours, being on your knees and you got your hands down there. So he kind of pulls him up, gets him on all fours. And again, he says the same thing Gabriel did. He says, you are greatly beloved. By who? By God. All right? So he confirms, not that Gabriel needed confirmation, but he confirms what Gabriel said. So hopefully that would encourage him. And so he says that he was, God sent him, and Daniel needs to understand what I've come to tell you something. You need to understand what I'm here to tell you. And so then he tells Daniel to stand up. And remember, he's really weak. But he does, but he's trembling the whole time. So he manages to get on his feet, but he's trembling. And so we're told the angel came in response to Daniel's prayer, that prayer that we read or looked at a few minutes ago, and the fact that he was so humble about it. So that kind of leads us to question number 4. Why was Daniel greatly beloved by God? Why was he loved? I mean, he was a sinner after all, but why'd God love him so much?
Verse 12 says that he had set his heart to understand.
Yeah. He wanted to know the will of God. So yes, he's an imperfect human, as we all are. But if we set our mind on, I want to know the will of God, I want to try to obey it to the best of my ability, that's what Daniel was doing. He was trying his hardest to be a righteous servant of God, even though he's going to stumble occasionally, because we all are. Okay, but that's why he was greatly beloved. And so the angel tells Daniel, you don't have any reason, you're scared to death, you need to stop being afraid. You have nothing to be afraid of. Okay? And so he says something kind of interesting there in verse 13. So apparently this angel had been held up by another angel for some reason. Something having to do with Medo-Persia. So he said, I was delayed there for a while. But then somebody, another angel, is going to intervene to get him there. And this one's given a name. Michael. Okay. Now, Michael's not just any ordinary angel, not that they're ordinary, but Michael's an archangel. How do we know that? Because, yeah, the Bible tells us, right? He's an archangel. What does that mean? Yeah, apparently he is in charge of other angels, so there must be ranks among angels, and he's the top dog or one of the top dogs. He's an archangel. Is Gabriel an archangel? We don't know. He's never called that. Michael is in the Bible. The Bible does not call Gabriel an archangel, but he's the only other one that's mentioned by name. So he might be, but we really don't know. But we know that Michael is. And so he says, I was delayed for a while, but then Michael came and allowed me to come here and talk to you. Okay, and so he gives him this vision that this is what's going to happen to Israel, to the Jews, in what is called here the latter days. He says, in the latter days, these are things that are going to happen. So he's saying this vision's not going to be fulfilled for some time. It will eventually, but that's going to be in the latter days. Okay? So when are the latter days? Well, again, some people want, well, this is talking about the end of time, the end of the world. But again, look at the context. It's clearly talking about the coming of Christ and the end of the old law. And it probably goes up to the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's the latter days. Okay? In the context, that's what this has to mean here. From the coming of Christ basically up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Daniel, of course, had already foretold about future events. He talked about in chapter 2 the creation of the church. We talked about in chapter 7 those earthly kingdoms that were going to affect Israel. Now, in chapter 9, he talked about the coming of the Messiah, the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is just in a pattern, a series of these things. I need to go back. I wasn't quite ready to get off that yet. I'll stay on there. So Daniel is overwhelmed by this information that he is given. And so he puts his face to the ground again. And it says here that he was struck dumb. What does that mean? Couldn't talk. Yeah, he'd lost his ability to talk. Maybe he was in shock or whatever. But he was unable to speak. So then it says another angel appears and restores his speech to him. And so Daniel calls him Lord, but it's not to worship him. It's just it's a term of respect. He knows this is not God that he's talking to. But he tells the angel, said, look, these things that you've told me, it's just zapped my strength. It's filled me full of sorrow. I'm just overwhelmed by this. And so the angel touches Daniel again, and what happens? His strength is restored to him. Okay? So we did number 5, what are the latter days, and how did Daniel react? Again, he was full of sorrow, he was weak, he was in shock. What did the angel tell Daniel to do? Well, he told him to be at peace. He told him to have no fear. You don't need to be afraid. And he told him to remain. I've restored your strength. You need to remain strong. So be at peace. Have no fear. Remain strong. Then it tells us that this angel, along with Michael, they're going to work, of course, as they always do. They're going to work for God's purpose. They're going to work against God's enemies. That kind of goes without saying, but he says it anyway. And it talks about they're going to work some way against the Medo-Persians. That kind of paved the way for the Greeks to conquer them. We're not told what they're going to do or how they're going to do it, but it just gives you some indication. They're going to do something that's going to make it a little easier for Alexander to conquer the Medo-Persians because their time is up. You know, we don't know how it'll be done or what it is, but just that it will happen. They're going to do something. All right. Chapter 11. All right, so the focus in chapter 11, this is going to be on some of the rulers who will have an impact on the Jews. Okay, and all the stuff that is discussed here, these things will all take place after Daniel's death. This is nothing that he will witness himself. Okay. So our question, what time period or dates does this chapter basically cover? There you go. About 530 BC, that is the death of Cyrus. Until about 164 BC, that is the death of our good friend and buddy and Boy Scout, Antiochus IV, who we said was so wicked to the Jews. So he dies in 164 BC. So, and it's interesting, secular history basically confirms the predictions that are made in this chapter, so it's more proof of the Bible. So that's the basic time period that we're looking at here. So again, this is long after Daniel is dead. And so a lot of this kind of overlaps what we call the intertestamental period. What is that? Between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, right? So they kind of overlap because you're looking at, the writing of the last books of the Old Testament that were written were Nehemiah and Malachi, and that was like in the mid 400s BC. And so that's the end of the Old Testament revelation, and then of course 1 AD, the birth of Christ. And then you've got Matthew, Mark, that's when that picks up. So how long is the intertestamental period? Roughly about 400 years. So these two have a lot of overlap, not totally, but it's about the same time period. Okay, so number 2, yeah, how long was it? About 400 years. All right, so in verses 1 and 2, so again, you got the angel here. He's still talking to Daniel like he was at the end of chapter 10. Remember back then there were no chapters, and so this is a continuation for these first few verses. And so he's prophesying about the Medo-Persians in the latter days. He's talking about them. So as we just said, King Cyrus, he's going to die about 530 BC. After him, there will follow 3 more kings. I'm looking at the wrong chapter. So you see that in verse 2. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia or Greece. Okay? So there'll be 3 other kings after Cyrus of not a lot of consequence for our purposes. But that 4th king says he's going to be a lot richer and stronger than all the other ones. He's going to be a significant person. And that 4th king is King Xerxes the First. And those are the years he reigns, from about 20 years, 485 to 465 BC. That's the 4th king that's mentioned here in verse 2. Okay? He's called Ahasuerus in the Bible, but Xerxes. But he has a wife that any Bible student would be well familiar with. Anybody know? Yeah, Esther. So his wife is Esther. Okay, so that's question number 3. Xerxes the First, and Esther is his wife. Now in verses 3 and 4, he starts talking about Greece. So he'd been talking about the Medo-Persians. Now he switched over, talks about Greece. And so this is verses 3 and 4. That's about 130 years after verses 1 and 2. So there's a time gap there. So it talks about this mighty king of Greece, which would be who? Alexander the Great, again, reference to him. We saw in chapter 8, he's the great horn of the male goats. We already looked at that. Here again, you see another reference to the 4 generals that are going to take over his empire after his death. Then verses 5 through 20. So remember, after Alexander, you got 4 generals. They take over 4 different regions. Well, in this chapter, they're only going to discuss 2 of those 4 regions. Okay? And we'll notice why here and say, why are they going to talk about them? Well, there's a reason for that. But 2 of those will be discussed. And so it talks about the king of the south and the king of the north. Okay, the king of the south, that is Egypt, which came from Ptolemy. And then the king of the north, that's Syria, as we said, the Seleucid kings, which Antiochus was one of those. Okay? So this chapter really talks about the conflict between Egypt and Syria, 2 of the 4 kingdoms that came out of Alexander's empire. Now, that can bring us to a very good question. Why? What has this got to do with the Jews? I mean, why would the angel be talking about Egypt and Syria? And you have a clue if you look at the map. Okay? Here's Egypt. Here's Syria. Where's Israel? Right smack in the middle. Okay? So there's going to be massive conflict between Egypt and Syria, and guess where they're going to do a lot of their fighting? In Israel. Okay? That's where they're right in the middle of the battlefield. So when Israel attacks Syria, Jerusalem's going to be affected. When Syria attacks Egypt, Jerusalem's going to be affected. And both of them, the Syrians and the Egyptians, when they go through to beat up on the other one, they look around and go, hey, this Jerusalem's pretty nice. I wouldn't mind taking this for myself. So they both have eyes on Jerusalem too, along with trying to kill each other. Well, I wouldn't mind having this piece of real estate right here. So that's why the angel talks about them. He's saying these two kingdoms are really going to affect the Jewish people. Whether you want it or not, you're going to get it, okay? Because you're right in the middle of these two kingdoms. So that's why this chapter is really talking about this, okay? So that's question 4, 5, 6. Verses 21 through 35. This part pretty much discusses Antiochus again. As we said, he's a king of Syria from 175 to 164, so we already talked about that. What did the Jews call him again? The madman. Yeah, he's the madman. This guy's crazy. He hates us, and he interfered with all their religious practices. Okay? We noted that he fit the description of the little horn that we talked about earlier that came out of the Greek Empire. Again, one of those 4 generals. So the Bible here describes him as a vile man, full of intrigue and flatteries, it says. Okay? So he's very cruel, he's very evil. He's not above flattering somebody falsely to get what he wants. He's always plotting against somebody, especially the Jews, but not just them. Again, if you look at the secular history, you'll see that. He was not a very pleasant person. Now, we saw in chapter 8, again, that he disrupted all the Jewish religious activities. Again, you can read about that in secular history, too. It's well documented, not just with what the Bible tells us. So we talked about all the religious stuff that he did to them. In addition to that, he also enslaved a lot of the Jews, thousands of Jews, and he killed tens of thousands of Jews. Then we come to verses 32 and 35, or 32 through 35, rather. And what we see here is that, as you would expect, some of the Jews, when they're under this persecution, like we saw even under Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and of course Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar gave these rules against God, what did they do? Did they go along with it, or did they refuse? They refused, right? But you know, a lot of the other Jews went along with it. Well, same thing here. Some of the Jews it mentions here, they're going to cave in, go along to get along. They're going to jump right in there and do wicked things along with everybody else. But not all of them. So some of them will stay firm. And it mentions even to go so far as they are actively teaching people about God, trying to convert people. What do you think will happen to them? Yeah, they're not going to get some kind of reward, right? He's going to kill them. So most all of them will be martyred for the cause of God. And we see again here this mention, the time of the end. Once again, in the context, it's not talking about the end of the world. It's talking about the end of these persecutions. So it's horrible, but it will come to an end. Okay? So it tells that, God will deal with this guy just like he deals with everybody else. But he's going to be allowed to be there for a while, because even Daniel said the Jews were still living in their sins. They had not come out of that. So things still have to happen. Oh, Antiochus, it's about him. And those are the years he ruled, so we already talked about that. Yeah, he's the king of Syria. Yeah. Okay. Then the last part of chapter 11, roughly the last 10 verses or so, there is if you read through it, it's not crystal clear, right? So there's a lot of disagreement among biblical scholars. Like I said, guys a lot smarter than me. They disagree over what this means. What is this final section talking about? So there are kind of two schools of thought, and I think either one could be possible. I wish I had all the answers, but I don't. But some believe this is a continuation of the discussion about Antiochus. And they said, well, they're still talking about him. And that's certainly a possibility. Then there are other biblical scholars that they say, no, I don't think it's really talking about him anymore. I think they shifted gears. Now they're talking about the Roman Empire again. It's possible. Right? So we're really not sure. There's still a lot of debate about that, but certain things you look at when you read it and you think, yeah, it could be the Romans, and then you go, well, I don't know, that might better fit Antiochus. It's kind of hard to say, but here's what I am sure of about these verses, because again, these are among those that get misinterpreted by the premillennialists, right? So any interpretation of this last passage that deals with premillennialism, or anything like they'll claim, well, this is talking about the Antichrist. It's what they'll claim. That interpretation has to be wrong, even though I'm not sure if it's Antiochus, I'm not sure if the Romans, but I am sure it's not talking about the Antichrist. Why not? There's no such person. There is no one Antichrist. Anybody that's against Jesus is an Antichrist. There's probably hundreds of them within 5 miles of this building, right? That are just, they don't like Jesus, they don't care anything about Jesus. They're an Antichrist. So they're talking about, no, there's going to be this one world dictator, and any interpretation of this that goes in that direction, it's false. That's clearly not what this is talking about. How do we know that? Because, again, we can't go down that rabbit hole, but it would contradict so many other Bible verses. And what do we know if my interpretation of this contradicts something that's obvious over here? What does that mean? I'm wrong. I have misinterpreted this one. So this one might be a little fuzzy, but if it goes against something that's crystal clear, then that can't be the right interpretation. It's got to be something else, right? So there are other verses in the Bible that refute that interpretation, so that can't be what it's talking about. So it's probably either Antiochus or it's about the Romans. It's not about the Antichrist. All right, so let's go then, finally, to chapter 12. So, yeah, we answered all those questions. All right, so chapter 12. So in the first few verses 1 through 4 of this chapter, the angel is still talking to Daniel. So it's a continuation. Again, there weren't chapters back then, so it's a continuation. He talks again about at that time or the time of the end. As we said, this may be a continuation. Whatever the end of chapter 11 is, if that was about Antiochus, then this might be as well. Or maybe it was about the Romans, then this would be that as well. So it might be talking about the end of Antiochus. It might be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, a lot of scholars debate that. What we do know is it tells us here that the archangel Michael, he's going to help the Jews in some way. It doesn't tell us how, but it says he's going to help the Jews. He's going to stand up for them. But does that mean that they will not suffer any persecution? No, he's not going to end their suffering, but he will stand up for them in some way. Again, we're not told how, but they're still going to be persecuted, but also they will ultimately be delivered. Okay, so number two, who'd be delivered in the end? Well, God's people, God's faithful children, they will be delivered in the end. But before that, they're going to suffer this persecution. And we already saw in Matthew 24, Jesus used similar discussions, similar language when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? Now again, let's look at the two possibilities here. So if it's connected to Antiochus, as it might be, then this would be a reference to the end of his persecution. Okay? When it talks about it coming to an end. If it's connected to the Romans, then it would be talking about those Jews who obeyed Jesus after the destruction. Those things will come to an end for them because they're going to be obedient to Christ. Okay, so it could be either or. There is a reference here to the book of life. So what is that? Whose book is it? The Lamb's, right? Christ, right? Who's in it? All the set, right? Do we want to be in it? I do too. I'm with you. Sign me up. I want to be in the book of life, because if I'm not in the book of life, what does that mean? We're lost. Yeah, we can't go to heaven. You got to be in the Lamb's book of life. So you see a reference to that here. Okay? And references in Revelation, of course, chapter 3, chapter 13, you see the references to that. Now, in verse 2, it talks about a resurrection. Now, this doesn't appear, again, in the context, it doesn't appear to be the bodily resurrection, at the end when Jesus returns. It doesn't really fit the context of what this passage is saying. So it must be talking about a spiritual awakening, a spiritual resurrection. Could be a reference to, when they return from exile. It might be when they turn to God because of the persecution of Antiochus. But apparently some kind of spiritual awakening, spiritual repentance, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, this is where Daniel in verse 4, he's told, because this is the last chapter, he's told by the angels to bring the book to a close. And it says, many are going to search for the meaning of this, right? But a lot of this won't really be known until the described events take place. So through the first 4 verses, the angel is still talking. He's been going for the last couple of chapters. Then we get to verse 5. Now Daniel, the angel stops talking. Now Daniel's going to talk. Okay? And he says that he sees what are apparently 2 other angels, other than the one he's been talking to, standing there he's still by the Tigris River, so they're there. And we see another reference to, we saw this earlier, the times and a half. And we said, what does that mean? Time singular, then times plural, and then a half. So 3.5 years. Okay, that 42 months. We've seen that several times referenced here. So you have one more reference to that. And then it talks about the holy people. Okay? So the holy people, that of course is God's chosen people. So, question number 3, who were God's chosen people then? The Jews, right? The Israelites. Number 4, who are God's chosen people now? Christians, members of the church, right? Okay? So then it would be the Israelites, but today it would be any Christian, any faithful Christian. Okay, then verses 8 through 13. Daniel says that he doesn't understand all the things the angel has told him. Welcome to the club. I don't either. I think we figured out some of it, but there's other things I don't understand. And like I said, apparently guys a lot smarter than me, they haven't really figured it out either. Okay, because they still have debate and disagreement over some of these things. So he doesn't understand it. He wants to know, what does it mean? So that kind of tells us something, not just about Daniel, but whether you're talking about any of God's prophets. They are told what to speak and they will say things, but do they always understand what they're talking about? No. God doesn't always explain everything. He just says, I want you to go say this. Okay. And they go say it and they go, what did I don't know what that means. Yeah. So they don't fully understand always. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And sometimes, like we've seen in Daniel, sometimes the angels completely explain it to him. And sometimes they don't. And the angels here, they're not going to tell Daniel everything. They're going to tell him what he needs to know. But they're not going to tell him everything. So we see there in verse 10 that some people, this is just like today, right? Some people will obey God, and they will be purified, they will be blessed, they will be saved. Some people won't, and of course they'll be lost. So that hasn't changed. Okay, then verse 11, and again, this seems to be a reference to Antiochus. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So remember, he took away their ability to sacrifice. He wouldn't let them do it, except for his pig sacrifices. But he would not let them make the sacrifices that God told them to make. Okay, so that looks like that's a reference. Again, he talks about abomination and desolation. Jesus used that same language. From what?
From what to what?
What do you mean, what to what?
From the desolation? Before you said
Yeah, from the time that, it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. So you see the abomination there, you see desolate.
he was describing
It's the same phrase that Jesus, when he talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. But this could be a reference again to the end of Antiochus, because he's the one that stopped their sacrifices. And then you've got some, 1,290 days, 1,335 days. What does that mean? I don't know. Maybe it just signifies a very long period of time. I don't seem to be able to find like a specific reference that, oh, that's got to be this. So, but it might just mean this is a long period of time. Now, then the book closes in verse 13 with a message of comfort. So again, question number 5, that was again the destruction of Jerusalem. I think we answered that. Number 6, how does the angel comfort Daniel? So he tells him, look, any faithful servant, which you are, and anybody that's like you that's a faithful servant, you're going to have blessings. God is going to bless you. God is going to give you rest at some point. Okay? How long do you have to stay faithful? Till you die, right? Revelation 2:10, right? But he said, you guys that are faithful, and if you stay faithful, you're going to get that crown of life. I know you've suffered through some things, but you're going to win in the end. Now, we may have some frustration because we don't understand all of this, and the abomination of desolation. Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. So, does God tell us everything? Are y'all still awake? Does God tell us everything? No? You're writing, okay. No, the secret things belong to the Lord, right? So, do I need to complain about that? God, you got to tell me everything. Well, He doesn't owe me an explanation for everything. If I have faith in God, then I need to acknowledge, you know what? He's in control of the universe. I'm just going to let Him run things. Whatever He thinks I need to know, I'll know. And the other things, says that belongs to Him. So it can frustrate us sometimes, but kind of keep that in mind. And then, of course, 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved. God wants us to continue to study His Word and try to rightly divide it, to understand it. Okay, so it's all right to admit that we don't know everything, because we don't. But we do know all we need to know to gain our salvation. We know those things. So hopefully, I hope this has been a very profitable study for you. I know it has been for me, so I hope it has been for you. And now, for those that are taking it for credit, and anybody else that wants a copy of the test, you can have it. I don't know why you'd want one, but anyway. Yeah, Angie doesn't want one either. She just doesn't have a choice. So. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about this. So, yes. Yeah. Okay, let me explain this, because I need to get out here, and then very quick I'll give anybody else that wants one. So you can see at the top there for your exam, you can use three things. You can use the Bible, you can use your notes, you can use these study questions. Please do not Google anything, do not use anything else. I assure you, every answer you need is in those three places. Okay, so please just use those things. On my syllabus is the address at Etowah for our post office box. Just mail this to me. Try to get it to me within the next week. I'm not going to bust your chops over that, but don't wait a month, okay? Try to get it to me in the next week to 10 days so I can get the grades to Rick, and we'll finalize it. All right, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. God bless.